And tomorrow is a very special day for Dubliners and for fans of literature. June 16th is Bloomsday. That's a day when the city of Dublin and many other cities erupt with celebrations of the work of James Joyce, the author of Ulysses. Now, Ulysses is a gigantic, challenging tome of a book, and it takes place over the course of one day, just one day in Dublin. Our books expert Spencer Stuart came by to talk with Matthew Parsons about Bloomsday, and they started with the obvious, the significance of the day, June the 16th.
That is the day within the novel itself where it takes place. So it's June 16th, 1904. And after the publishing of Ulysses in its book form, February 2nd of 1922, there were indeed people who followed Joyce and friends of Joyce that celebrated this day on kind of a sort of private, smaller scale. But it really ballooned into what it is today as a kind of international event around the 50th anniversary of Bloomsday itself, so June 16th, 1954, in which Partick Kavanagh and Flann O'Brien, as well as a number of other people, including Joyce's cousin, wandered around Dublin to the various spots that are mentioned in Ulysses, reading various passages. They famously didn't get very far because, of course, there are some pubs that you have to stop in at
sure.
from the novel itself, and so they had to abandon the project due to ill health. So,
okay, so tell me a little bit more about what actually goes on at a Bloomsday celebration.
Sure. So within the Dublin context, of course, they go to the sites. But internationally, it's celebrated in Montreal within the sort of Canadian context most thoroughly. People dress up much like the character, and they go to various sites and they recite various sections from the novel, as well as eat some of the food that's mentioned in it as well. There's a sort of famous breakfast that Leopold Bloom prepares at the beginning of the novel that everyone sort of enjoys eating and talking about the novel. So it's really a sort of a celebration of all of those really fine details that you find within Ulysses.
You mentioned that it started as sort of a private type thing. Tell me a little bit about how the event grew into the kind of institution that it is, because particularly in Dublin, it's a major celebration, right?
Yeah, well, it's almost 2 weeks long in Dublin now.
Oh my!
It becomes almost like a festival for Joyce, and scholars kind of come in and they have various roundtables and things like that. So it's really it's an excuse to sort of come together and discuss the various contributions of Joyce.
That's 14 times as long as the book takes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it's also a time where there's discussions about Joyce's letters and manuscripts and all sorts of things connected to him from an archival perspective are sort of spread all over the world in various collections. So it's often a time to discuss bringing those together and trying to piece together Joyce's practice as a writer, because one of the first things that's most striking about Ulysses is not only its varieties of style, but it's also its references culturally. It's clearly a writer who's constantly thinking about what to put into the novel. And indeed, reading Ulysses, it's brimming with references, cultural references, both high and low. It's sort of all over the place, which is what makes it so dynamic and interesting today.
So on that note, tell me a little bit about the origin story of this novel. It had sort of a protracted birth phase, didn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. To contextualize Ulysses in relation to Joyce's work, he starts out in about 1905 trying to publish Dubliners. This takes about 9 years to do.
A short story collection.
Yes, that's correct. And what ends up happening is, he almost secures a publisher in 1906, but the printer rejects publishing it because of some of the crass words that are used. And so to understand Ulysses, it's really to understand from 1905 to about 1920, in which Joyce meets for the first time Sylvia Beach, an absolute champion of his writing, that Joyce struggled to try and get his writing out there. Certainly within the circles of Ezra Pound and other literary figures, they recognized him immediately as an excellent writer. But it was really the sort of pioneering spirit of not only Sylvia Beach, but also of Jean Heap and Margaret Anderson, who ran the Little Review in New York, who started serializing Ulysses before it turned into a novel in 1922.
So while Ulysses was being serialized in magazines, how were people responding to it? This is famously something of a confounding novel.
Yeah, the response within literary circles, within the critics of the time, some say, they can't really recognize it as anything, but they can understand that there's something really quite significant going on. It's like nothing else that anyone was really reading at the time. Within the context of it being serialized in the United States, this starts in 1918 with the little review out of the West Village in New York by the mentioned Heap and Anderson. And they're publishing it as various chapters. And at that point in time, it gets in the hands of a censor within the Postal Service who ultimately confiscates them and burns the serials. There are still some copies that exist, but this was an attempt to sort of silence them. It was then in 1921, just a year before the publishing of the book itself, that there was an actual court case in which the Society for the Suppression of Vice, based in New York, led by John Sumner, claimed that the serial, or subsequently the novel, was an obscene piece of literature.
So tell me more about this society. They seem like such fun people.
Yeah, so they were really a group that was trying to censor all sort of types of behavior they felt to be indecent. It was so the story goes, the way in which Ulysses got in front of John Sumner, the head of this society, was through a friend of his who was a businessman who found the little review in his daughter's room, and he brought it to John Sumner. And John Sumner read it and, of course, then put together the defense for it. And ultimately what happened was Heap and Anderson weren't very well represented by their lawyer. And what ultimately resulted was a fine of $50, and they ceased printing it at that time. So.
I love the idea that finding an extract from the as yet unpublished Ulysses in your daughter's bedroom is like tantamount to finding contraband or something.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we've gone up or down in terms of cultural reference here, but yeah, it's quite surprising as an origin story for it. And indeed, at the same time in the United Kingdom, there was also another serialization of Ulysses that was happening by Harriet Shaw Weaver, who is also a patron of Joyce's. She famously anonymously sent him money during that difficult period of 1905 to 1920 in which he was trying to publish his works. And she was also shut down, but she was shut down primarily by her printer. The printer actually started to object to the content. Printers do play a part in this in terms of what they feel comfortable printing, because their sort of reputation is on the line as well, and in some cases more than the publishers themselves. But yeah.
And how did the obscenity trials in the United States play out eventually? It
was deemed obscene in 1921, and that continued until 1933, in which a judge by the name of Wolsey ultimately decided that and this became precedent within definitions of obscenity within the United States, that the various passages that were in question, in fact served the purpose of the larger novel itself. And that was quite significant as a decision. And it's very interesting to read his ultimate statement that leads to this decision. It reads sort of half as legal jargon, but also he's discussing the actual literary merit of Ulysses as a book. And subsequently, the next year, 1934, you see the first U.S. edition published by Random House, in which 33,000 copies were purchased in 2 weeks. So,
you mentioned this very important figure, Sylvia Beach, in the life of James Joyce. Tell me a little bit more about her and how they related to each other.
Yeah, so she's the founder of Shakespeare and Company, which was a famous bookstore in Paris. It's still in some sort of form exists in Paris, but not in the same place. And it's kind of more of a tourist attraction than it was initially. And that bookstore opened in 1919, and it was really a kind of haven for a lot of expat writers: Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and Joyce. And what happened is in 1920, Joyce met Beach at a party, which was being hosted by Adrienne Monnier, who was a life partner of Sylvia Beach. And at this party, they sort of struck up a conversation and started to build a friendship. And it was around that time that she offered to publish Ulysses as a book. They get in touch with a printer based in Dijon by the name of Derentière. And he was an interesting character as well. He's a sort of publisher of avant-garde print and was very interested in sort of helping the cause. And so he takes up the massive project of printing Ulysses, ultimately creating 1,000 copies, 100 of which are printed on Dutch paper and signed by Joyce, 150 rather, which are printed on Archer's paper. It's a sort of French paper that's dried and numbered. And then there are 750 other copies that were done on handmade paper. Yeah.
Do we know where any of these are these days? Are they all still around?
They're well documented, and people keep an eye on them, certainly, and they're in special collections and private collections. One of the things about the book is that it's a tome. It's a massive piece, and it's put together in a rather delicate way. Basically, reading the book in the first edition form breaks the book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the gatherings or the choirs of the actual text itself were woven into the jacket of Ulysses, which was effectively kind of hard stock form of paper that had been lithographed on with a sort of famous Aegean blue or Greek flag blue, which was specified by Joyce. And what ends up happening is as you're opening it, it starts to kind of fall apart. And often when you see first editions, I've seen a couple working with them, they're almost always reworked or there's been repairs done to the spine because it starts to fall apart. So it's quite a fragile piece.
I want to go back to the American obscenity trial for a second. Mm-hmm. I wonder how the eventual result of that ordeal has influenced the way that literature has been received in the United States since then.
I mean, the other trial that comes to mind is Allen Ginsberg's trial for Howell, in which a sort of similar decision ultimately is made about the continuity or the assessing the part of a piece in relation to the whole. And it is tough to estimate actually how that trial did change people's perceptions of it. It made it absolutely a scandal for people to take a look at the book. Obviously, the next year when it comes out, people want to sort of see what it's all about. But I think it sort of raises those questions as to the relationship between content and style and how it builds ultimately to an experience, which was something like you see in Ulysses.
The thing that always strikes me about Bloomsday celebrations when I hear about them is how a work of literature that is so famously considered difficult and sometimes unreadable can inspire such a mass outpouring of national pride in Ireland and just fellow feeling generally.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how Ulysses has come to be this sort of cultural totem, even in spite of its impenetrable text?
Yeah, there have been several articles that have been written over the years about what would Joyce have thought of Bloomsday. Within his life, when people sort of sent him flowers that matched the color of the cover and things like this, I think it was probably just like a charming, nice way of acknowledging his contribution. But, after his death in 1941 and then subsequently the ballooning of it to the end of the century, it becomes almost like a form of mythology of him himself. And he sort of famously rejected that. He, of course, did have quite a high thought of himself as a writer within his life. But I think he would have had slight reservations about the explosion that has taken on since 1954. But at the same time, there's certainly people that come to Bloomsday from reading the book and they're interested in it, and then there are people that maybe start to read Ulysses because of it. Maybe someone who's in Dublin or someone around the world who sees people wearing, that famous sort of the straw hat and the circular glasses, and maybe it draws people in. I mean, certainly Bloomsday now brings people in because it's just it's a sort of fun event for the city. And not really so much because they've finished Ulysses and are trying to kind of reanimate it in a funny way.
I think more people ought to read it. I had a great time reading Ulysses. There's some bits of it I still have absolutely no idea what's going on, but the bits of it that I do understand are often incredibly funny. Much of it is incredibly moving and beautiful. I mean, the last chapter where Molly Bloom finally gets gets center stage has some really, really tremendous language in it. Yeah,
I always say to people who are talking about approaching Ulysses to sort of take your time with it and go easy on yourself about it. There is a huge monolithic presence to the book itself within the 20th century. But to get into Leopold's voice that's almost staccatoed and sounds almost like a telegraph at times, and also the way in which it changes. I think the sort of seventh section in which it turns into a newspaper because they enter into into one of the newspaper offices. Those sort of twists and changes really, they're so surprising the first time you read it. And
completely meaningless headlines just kind of suddenly permeating the text. Only once more that soap is one that I remember, which out of context means nothing.
Well, and it's an amazing exploration of type, which that was happening in the 20s, and Derentière didn't turn away from it as a printer. He did that, and I think that's really a kind of testament to how many people believed in the project. The other thing about it is Joyce's exploration of sound, the way he actually writes in almost a phonetic style. A cat doesn't simply meow; he sort of writes it in a much more expressive manner. Those elements of it are what make it really remarkable as a text, for sure. And of course, the kind of internal monologue that it introduces to literature is sort of a powder keg within the century that we continue to use quite often in contemporary literature, and is a really powerful way of conveying emotion and creating a relationship between a reader and those characters.
Oh, those two might convince me to give it a try yet again. That's Spencer Stuart, our books expert, talking there to Matthew Parsons about James Joyce's Ulysses. Tomorrow is Bloomsday, June the 16th, the day in which the story of Ulysses takes place. So happy Bloomsday a bit in advance. And if you've had an experience reading Ulysses, or if you'd like to encourage others to do so, you can always send a note, nxnw@cbc.com.